In 1971, I was expelled from high school. It was a terrible year. I was a mess. There were no injustices. I wasn't treated badly. I was a very unhappy teenager, and I took it out on my teachers. And so in many ways it was inevitable that I was going to be expelled from school. It was traumatic for me, and as you can guess, it was traumatic for my parents. But there was one shining light in that period that still shines today. And so, on the one hand, while I was in all manner of mess and deeply troubled, there was a remarkable teacher there, an English teacher, senior English teacher, Mr. Robertson. And during that tempestuous year, and in the years to follow, he encouraged me to write poetry. And after that year, I wrote poetry for many years and used to send the poems to him for his comments and critique. And he continued through thick and thin to stick by me and encourage me to write poetry. Now, of course, the point of this recollection is not about the poems or poetry, but there was something about Mr. Robertson and his relationship with me which was remarkable. He treated me as though I was a person of irreplaceable value. He saw something precious in me which I couldn't see, and I don't think many others did all. And his regard for me, the respect, his kindness, I think helped me survive that year and that troubled phase of my life. In a moment, I'm going to reflect upon the value that we place in others, the regard we have for others, and about treating others as irreplaceable. But I want to underline the importance of relationships, Mr. Robertson's kindness, his relationship with me, and how he regarded me. He regarded me as irreplaceable. What a remarkable gift. This Sunday in Christian churches throughout the world we celebrate Palm Sunday. And in a moment we're going to explore the significance of Palm Sunday. And what I want to suggest is that Palm Sunday represents a radical statement about the significance of the other person. It's about valuing the other person. It's about seeing the other person as irreplaceable. And in short, this is why the Romans killed Jesus. So let's begin with the story. It's a very familiar story. I'm thinking now of the version from the Gospel of Mark. It has elements of the triumphant entry, probably at two levels. It was quite common in the Middle East for a conquering king or general to make a triumphant entry. In some cases, a new gateway or new roadway might be built, and for the conquering king to be greeted with acclamation. This is also true of some of the Jewish resistance leaders, that they were probably greeted with acclamation as conquering resistance leaders. But there are elements in the text that are really important for us to note. And this arrival of Jesus is on the surface, it looks like the conquering king. But when we go a bit deeper, it's about a very different regime, a very different way of operating. So let's put the text in historical context. First of all, this is the Gospel of Mark. It's been composed around the year 69 AD. This is a very difficult time in the life of the Jewish people. They've been in conflict with the Romans for about 3 years. So the writer of the Gospel of Mark is gathering various stories and sayings about Jesus and composing them for a Christian community which is under threat. And it's under threat because of the immediate confrontation with Rome. But you know, for decades it had lived under the shadow of Rome. Now, in order to appreciate the significance of the Gospel of Mark, there always has to be this tension. We have to remember this tension between early Christian communities and the Empire of Rome. With the Empire of Rome, which was incredibly well organised, nothing was spared in order to maintain the peace of Rome. In other words, individuals and communities were sacrificed at whim in order to restore the peace of Rome. The integrity, the structural integrity of Rome and its expansion was the most important thing. Now, Rome ruled the Mediterranean region through a series of client states. So, for example, in the province of Judea, of course, there was a Roman governor in Pilate, but the appointments of the chief priests and the chief tax collector were Roman appointments. And because they were Roman appointments, it meant that the temple itself was a symbol or bastion of Roman power. In contrast, we have this Jesus. On the face of things, he presents in this particular story, that is what we know as Palm Sunday and the triumphal entry, as an alternative king. But this leader brings in a radically different set of values. There's a very strong ethical component in the ministry of Jesus. If we're to appreciate the ministry of Jesus, we need to understand the radical nature of Christian values. So in contrast to the way of Rome, where everyone must pay the price ultimately for the peace of Rome, in the way of Jesus, every single person is of irreplaceable value. Think of your favourite Jesus stories. For one that always comes back to me is the woman who hemorrhaged. She was doubly marginalised because she was a woman, and marginalised because of the issue of blood and pollution. But Jesus allows her to touch his garment. Her life is transformed, and Jesus blesses this woman. This woman who was the total outcast was seen by Jesus as a person of irreplaceable value. So, okay, we have the so-called triumphal entry of Jesus, but I want to rephrase it or give it a new title. Rather than the triumphant entry, it is the arrival of the subversive. Jesus comes with a new sense of community, with a new set of values. In the community that Jesus is building, this community of equals, every single person is regarded as being of irreplaceable value. Every single person is seen as precious, as having intrinsic value, as having intrinsic worth. So if we step back for a moment and remember that this is a prelude to the passion and crucifixion in the Gospel of Mark, we have to remind ourselves that it was the Romans who killed Jesus, and they used a Roman form of execution in the crucifixion, which was reserved for either traitors or subversives. Jesus came preaching and enacting a different set of values which had social, religious and political implications. No wonder the Romans killed him. Now, in terms of our own day, we seem to be suffering, in a sense, from in an ethical desert. There don't seem to be too many discussions about ethics and the value of people and the worth of people. At the moment in Australia, there's a great deal of debate about Canberra, our political capital, and the issue of sexual violence. And if I can just make two observations, the most damning thing about this debate has been the lack of remorse by our leaders. I mean, spontaneous remorse for the violence and abuse that women have experienced in Canberra and throughout Australia. And that is partly as a result of some ethical issues. In other words, because many people, and particularly many men, do not see women, and in some cases children, as of irreplaceable value. In other words, women are often seen as objects or possessions or entitlements. Then this gives certain men or certain groups that sense of privilege or entitlement to do what they like. I think it's important in Australia that as part of the process of cultural change, we revisit the issue of values and the values that we ascribe to others. In the Jesus tradition, the starting point would be in this debate is that these women, these victims and these survivors are of irreplaceable value. They are precious. And once the debate about sexual violence and domestic abuse begins on that premise, it changes the way we conduct ourselves. Now, we live in an era where, as I said, ethical issues seem to have gone by the way. We live in the so-called neoliberal era, where the great myth or illusion of the free market is going to fix everything up. But we know that the real premise of the free market is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And in fact, it's the era of the disposable. There are disposable individuals, disposable communities. These individuals, these communities are expendable in order to maintain not the peace of Rome, but the profitability of the modern empires, or the equivalent of the modern empires. Somehow, some way, we need to find opportunities to generate discussions, ethical discussions about the value of the human person. I have in my possession the letter from my expulsion letter. So this was 1971. I was expelled, and Mr. Hugh Stutchbury, the poor, worn-out headmaster, had to write this letter. Actually, it was quite a charming letter, really. He saw great potential in me. Perhaps they said that about everyone, but he saw great potential in me, and there's an element of lament or regret that I had to go to another high school. But it's funny, whilst it was a very difficult year for me, I don't look back on it with sadness, because I met this Mr. Robertson, this saint-like Mr. Robertson. He was a very modest, unassuming, introverted man, but he had this big heart, this big, generous heart, and he saw something in me. He treated me not simply with respect, which he did, but he treated me as though I was of irreplaceable value. He saw something precious in me. And that encounter with Mr. Robertson became a shining light for me in those dark years. And in many ways, he enacted the ethic and the practice of the Jesus movement, which begins by the regard that we have for other people. In other words, regardless of a person's race, gender, class, or social status. In the Jesus practice, in relationship to the values of the early Jesus movement, the other person is irreplaceable. The other person is precious. The other person is sacred. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen.